Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking.
There's reasons to drop, and that's kind of a personal decision, and it doesn't always have to be a medical emergency to drop either. UTMB is probably the most severely off track of what I thought it was going to be in terms of how long it was taking me. I've had bad races, but I've had bad races that were like a little bit off the mark, but this was like hours off the mark. And I think that was really difficult mentally. And I'm a professional athlete. I get paid to do this. I was not having a good day.
Hey, it's Meredith. This is the Afternoon Snack Podcast. On today's episode, we have Addie Bracey. I actually went to high school with Addie, so we go like way back. She's an amazing athlete, coach, author, and advocate for the LGBTQ running community. She has literally run it all. She has over 20 years of competitive running experience. She was a 3-sport athlete at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She qualified for 3 Olympic trials in the marathon and 10,000 meter distance. She's a multi-time USATF national champion and a gold medal winner with Team USA at the World Championships for mountain running. She made the transition into ultra distance trail running and now runs professionally for Nike. She's run a lot of the big races that you've probably heard of. She came second in the Leadville 100. She's won Run Rabbit. She came top 10 at Western States. You get the idea. Her most recent race was UTMB 100, a 100-mile race in Mont Blanc, France, which we talk about on this episode. It's crazy. She has always been open with what the experience of being an athlete is like and how even at the highest level of sport, athletes deal with anxiety, imposter syndrome, and the fear of failure. She combines her extensive career with her background in sport and performance psychology. She has a master's from University of Denver to deliver amazing perspective and coaching to the athletes that she works with. She has authored a book on mental training for ultra running that is jam-packed with research and case studies and is an incredible resource for anyone who wants to better understand mental performance and the tools required to build more resiliency. This is a really, really cool episode, and I think you're going to love it. So we'll get into it. Addie Bracey, welcome to our show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to this one, partially because I've just followed along with you for your whole career, and that sounds really stalkery, and it is. But I wanted to, I guess, get a little bit, let's do some geography. Where are you located? Where do you live full time? What do you do? All that stuff.
I live in Colorado full time. I split time kind of equally between up in the mountains near Leadville and then here in Denver. Although moving permanently in a couple months, we just contracted on a house last week, so kind of tired of city life. I do kind of all things running-ish, I guess. So I coach, I run professionally for Nike, and I do some sports psychology consulting. So kind of all peripherally, I guess, in similar industry, but maybe some different roles throughout the day.
Yeah. And I find you really interesting because you can come at athletic performance from the angle of a very high level athlete, but also the coaching perspective, which is really unique. There aren't that many, I would say, high level athletes that also dabble in coaching and have coached for such a long time. I think that's a real sort of unique facet of who you are.
I do think it's pretty helpful. It does really benefit my coaching that I think especially, I'm sure we'll get to this, but kind of the emotional side of competing and racing. And as an aging athlete, that's something I've been navigating the last few years. And that seems really beneficial. A lot of the people I coach are in similar boats. And I think there's a relatability factor or some kind of bonding between coach and athlete when the coach is also out there kind of putting themselves in it and going through it. And I find that really helps the bond to know we're kind of both can relate in the experience of training and racing and that kind of thing.
I know with endurance sports, you can peak a little bit later. I guess that has something to do with training age and then the type of training. But what is kind of the peak for ultra endurance?
Yeah, I'm 38. So there's plenty of people in their late 30s, early 40s. Honestly, some people in their 50s that are still crushing 100-milers. And you two actually might be some interesting people to talk to about this. Just I know you do a lot of the nutrition and a lot of the other tangent things outside of just training that I think are so important. And so I'm not objectively that old. That being said, a lot of folks that are really high-level ultra runners found the sport later or used to be Nordic skiers or cyclist, and I've always been a runner. I've been running at a pretty high level since I was maybe 13 or 14. And I have some like theories or questions about like not just chronological age, but maybe like lifetime miles on your body. Or, I've raced probably 350 races in my life or more. And is there just like, but so many times you can kind of go to the well or something, I don't know. So it's been an interesting process the last few years. And then the biggest piece I think has been my superpower previously was I never got injured, like never. Trained really high mileage, never got hurt. In the last couple of years has kind of been one injury after the next. So kind of trying to navigate how to adjust training and nutrition has been a big change in my life to try to train as much as I used to be able to without getting hurt, which I haven't figured out the balance quite yet.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few angles. There's the actual training age and, literal miles on your body. And then from a competitive standpoint, there's so much that goes into RPE and motivation and perceived effort in races. And a lot of it is previous experience. And you have to wonder too, like with that many repetitions, kind of, going there as in like competition level intensity, what does that do to your ability to show up both in training and on race day? And maybe that's why you see Nordic skiers and cyclists and people that have that, they have the knowledge of working at really high intensities or kind of going into pain cave, but not necessarily with running. So that you still retain that, the advantage of the novelty. And when, the novelty is gone, then all you have is pain. So you really have to have like a high level of intrinsic motivation to continue to go there. Maybe that's part of it too. But that's such an interesting question because we don't have a lot of data on it.
Totally. Yeah. And it's like people push back when I say this, but it's true. I've just been getting slower for like the last 10 years. That's just like reality. If I can run 1 mile at my old marathon pace, I'm like pretty stoked about that. But at the same time, there are the days when I'm doing workouts and I'm like, wow, my like high school self would have like kicked my butt in this workout. That's, and that can affect motivation sometimes, or there's days when I'm like, why am I still doing this? But it's all relative. And I think the experience still feels very similar, even if the times on the watch are different, which is kind of what has kept me in it.
Yeah. And then, I mean, how do you manage that, the reference points and being able to look back? I mean, doing one, not that you've only done one type of running, but you've been a runner for your whole life. Like there's value in that, but there's also so many previous versions of yourself to compare to. So like, how do you manage the self-talk and what comes up with that?
I mean, I think that has kind of guided my journey through so many different events in the sport, is trying to find a way to hold on to that. If I was still training for track races or marathons, I don't think I would still be racing. I think it would be difficult for me to keep going out and, again, running maybe slower every time and maybe not seeing the point. I don't know that that's true. Actually, this year, and Meredith and I went to high school together, but I was like, I wonder if I could break my high school PRs this year. Maybe I could. That would be a fun thing to train for. So maybe I would still keep finding objective reasons, but it's really been the subjective experience that I hold on to. I personally haven't been able to find, I know that you both have competed, and when you compete, you go to this place and you learn things about yourself that nothing else I've ever found has allowed me to do that. And so if I hold on to that, that's kind of what keeps me going back. So can I run a mile as fast as I could when I was 17? No, but I also couldn't, 10 years ago have run UTMB like I did a month ago. So I think just finding ways to still keep learning and challenging myself in different ways and still kind of having that experience of preparing for something I'm not sure that I can do in a way that keeps me forward thinking and not reflecting on, I'm slower than I used to be, but I'm also a lot of other things that I didn't used to be too.
Did that kind of contribute, like that sort of evolution contribute to your switch from road racing, like short distance to longer distance to now? For me, I'm newer to running. I've been running a long time, but not really competitive. And I'm still recreational to a degree, but every season I take a couple months and I do some trail running to run a 50K. That's the last couple summers only. And I find that the switch to trail is a nice reprieve from looking at my watch so much and worrying about the time. And you run different routes, and there's really not really any expectations above and beyond your effort on that trail because you don't really have anything to go off of. And I'm wondering if that was kind of part of your transition to ultra endurance or trail running.
Totally. Yeah. I found trail running in 2016. It was an Olympic year, and I was training for the Olympic trials on the track, which I had run the previous cycle, and I couldn't make it. Like I was like a minute slower than I had been 4 years ago. So I retired completely for like a month until someone told me to come run the national championship trail race. And I got hooked on that exactly. Like I didn't even know how I was doing. I didn't even know how long the race was going to take me. I didn't even wear a watch, I don't think, because it's so irrelevant. Fast forward to now, I think what has allowed me more freedom in that space is there's like rough times maybe you're considering, but it can change year to year. It can change day to day depending on how the conditions are. There's just so many more variables that's really like not the focus. There's also a lot of other things you can get better at that affect performance other than just getting faster. Like nutrition is probably the big buzz thing in our sport right now, like fueling in races, technical skills. Like there's just so many other ways to measure performance, and pace is actually like pretty far down the list. So for sure, I think it was a nice break from, at the time, 15 years of track, and has certainly kept me in it now. I could tell you most of my races, maybe to the hour what I ran, but I wouldn't know like my exact time because it wasn't really like part of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
You came off UTMB. That was your last one, which was, I think, about maybe a month ago. And I remember I was keeping track. We have a local guy here that ran it, and it's a big one. It's all over social media, and it's really easy to keep track of. I got the impression the race didn't go quite how you wanted it to, but you did finish and said that it was a really meaningful experience. And I'm just wondering, maybe walk us through that. And for the people who don't know what UTMB is, maybe a bit of background on it as well.
Yeah. So UTMB is the gnarliest race ever, at least one of them. And I was expecting that, but it was even harder than I thought. It circumnavigates the Mont Blanc Massif, so the mountain range in the Alps. It's about 110 miles, 34-ish thousand feet of elevation gain, super steep. I live in the Rockies, and it still is like, you can't prepare for that. Women's ultra running in the last 10 years, but even the last 5 years is like on an insane trajectory, which is so cool to see. I think top 11 or 12 times this year would have been like third most years. So yeah, I trained, harder than I've probably ever trained, and got better at some of the things I've struggled with, which is hiking is one of them. It's a lot of hiking. It's so steep, getting really good with poles. I'm not really a skier, so I don't have, that skill set. And yeah, I felt like on a good day, I could be top 15, and on a great day, I could be top 10. And it just was never that. And I had personally actually struggled. It's an interesting topic because I haven't really heard anyone talk about this aspect of that race. And then I had another friend go through a similar experience at a race here in Colorado. It starts at 6 p.m. So women's winter is usually probably 24 to 26 hours. So if you do the math on that, like you're running through a whole night, through a whole day. It took me 30 hours. So I ran through a whole night, through a whole day into a night, which I'd never done. So my biggest challenge that I didn't train for and don't know how I would have trained for was actually the sleep deprivation was probably the thing that contributed to 90% of the problems I had. So again, just like things you never expect or predict. And I thought maybe I'd be sleepy, but I didn't predict what was actually happening, which was like crazy hallucinations, falling asleep while I was hiking, like sat down for a while and then was like, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm like in a race and I'm just kind of sitting on this rock in the woods by myself. So it was super meaningful to finish. I think 3,000 people started and maybe like over 1,000 dropped out. So it was the hardest thing I've ever done. And, 30 hours of moving is pretty insane. So was super happy to get it done, but had, obviously some mixed emotions when you kind of prepare that long for a race like that.
Yeah. I mean, falling asleep while hiking and walking that's such a foreign thing to even hear about. Like, is there any awareness when that's happening, or is it kind of you wake up, quote unquote, and realize what has happened?
I mean, that was kind of the hard part. Is I felt like I was kind of like sleepwalking or like daydreaming. And I think that the difficult part is that like most problems you're solving, yes, you get the less good at solving problems, the more mentally fatigued you get. And I've faced that where your emotions are more easily triggered, or you don't think as clearly when you're tired and, 18 hours into a race. But it felt like my cognitive functioning was like offline. And I think that was hard because it was difficult to problem solve when I felt like I didn't have the capacity to problem solve. So it looked like a lot of sitting at the aid stations for longer. I would say in the past, in a 100-miler, I'm probably never stopping more than maybe 5 to 8 minutes. When I was sitting for, like a half hour or 45 minutes at the crew stations just to chat through with my crew and like make a plan, or them kind of make sure I had everything because I wasn't doing a very good job of that. But I don't have the answer. I really struggled to pull myself out of it and never really found like a solution other than taking some caffeine, but that would only help for 2 hours.
Yeah, it's tough. Like if you think about, I guess Leadville starts at what, like 4:30? So you're running a little bit in the morning, but at least you've got somewhat of a full night's sleep under you. So you're running the majority of it during the day, and then you kind of run through the night. Or if, some people are slower, like they're running 30 hours, which I think is the cutoff, then you're running till the next morning. But at least the back half, you're kind of tired and like, that you just need to get through. The whole race isn't impacted by an overnight like run first. And I'm just thinking like that would impact your hunger. I mean, your hunger's already impacted when you're running out there, but the nighttime really adds a whole nother element. So it's like sleep, but also it's more difficult to eat during the night when you're running. I've only had one experience. I paced someone in Leadville on the overnight shift, and I don't think I ate anything. I mean, I was just pacing, but I'm like, I have like an upset stomach.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors. And I have run one race that went through the night, but it started in the afternoon. I think I finished at like sunrise. So you knew you just had to get to morning. But with this, I got to sunrise and I was only halfway. And that was kind of tough. I think the other challenging thing that's unique about UTMB is that you can't have pacers. So I think if I had had someone with me later when I was really struggling cognitively, that would have helped a lot, because it did help when I could talk and engage. But that's one reason why the race is so hard. You don't get help really. So it did make it kind of exacerbated, or there wasn't a lot to kind of pull you out. My watch also died. That is the most intense, like non-drug related trippy experience of my life. Like I felt like I was in like a time vortex. Like I didn't know how much time was passing or how much there weren't people around me really. It was really an interesting experience, seeing crazy things like all the rocks had scales on them and like little crabs were running around. And there was this guy with a boombox that was like everywhere, like all over the course. Like nothing that was scary, but it was just, I'd never experienced any of that. It was kind of wild.
Whoa.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And to think about the environment that people are into, it's really good there aren't more accidents with that.
Yeah. And I would say, like, I don't know that I necessarily ever felt like unsafe. The last cruise station I got to around maybe an hour before dark, my partner was there and I had been struggling a lot the previous section. And that one, I don't think I considered dropping, but I did tell her, I was like, I'm a little worried to go out for this next section knowing it's about to get dark. And it's actually like one of the harder sections, the last 10 miles. I don't think I ever necessarily felt unsafe, but at the same time, the cutoff for that race is, I think, like 47 hours. So, you know, who knows, like people that had been out there longer, maybe it does. I don't think it gets like life threatening, but I don't know. I would see people like sleeping on the side of the trail, and they actually give you, when you check in, this little sign that you can carry. I didn't carry one because I knew I wasn't going to sleep, but it says I'm just sleeping, because you just see people like laying off, like curled up on the side of the trail, and they don't want you to like assume someone's hurt or something, but it's pretty crazy. That being said, I know y'all live probably somewhere semi-similar to where I do, where here the mountains are like, you're in the wilderness. There, you're not in the wilderness. Like, it's like ski resorts. You know, there's little refuges like at the tops of the passes. I'm not saying it can't still be dangerous. It certainly can. The weather can change fast, but it's not like being somewhere here where you're a lot more remote and don't have access to help very fast. There's more infrastructure than that. So I don't think you're as maybe at risk as you would be here doing a race. Like here, they would never send you out, you know, at a hard rock or something without a pacer. That would be ridiculous.
Yeah, it's the same thing here. And I think part of the reason why there's not a longer race here is that you're like properly in backcountry. There's grizzly bears all over the place. The weather can change on a dime, even mid-July or August. So it's totally different. But the one thing, like the crowds at UTMB, that's just Europe, right? Like sporting events are different, but that's the thing that I've always noticed year to year is how many people show up for those races. And that has to be both at the start and then obviously at the finish has to be really special.
It's unlike anything ever. Yeah. There's so much like infrastructure. You're like running through towns the whole time, and all the big aid stations are like in town. So yeah, there's, hundreds, thousands of people. It has its challenges too. The start was pretty crazy for more than several miles, like 20 miles probably. And so, yeah, I had a hard time like bringing my heart rate down. And it's kind of wild because you run through the first 20 miles and then there's so many people. It's like the Tour de France or something. And then all of a sudden you're like out by yourself for 8 hours overnight and don't see a single person. So it's definitely a very unique race.
That's all very interesting. Things that you don't know when you watch on Instagram. But yeah, thanks for sharing that. My next question, we were trying to figure out what we could ask that kind of encompasses your experience and who you are as a person, athlete, your academic success, and your advocacy success, but then also use your experience as a psychologist and a coach to kind of three-part this question. So my first question is, given your success in multiple areas as an athlete, a professional, and an advocate, what traits do you think have allowed you to have success in all of those areas?
I've never been driven by like wanting to be the best. I just have wanted to like get to know myself better and like put myself in situations to find out more about myself physically, mentally, emotionally. That's why I went to grad school for sports psychology. I wanted to understand that more, that part of myself more. And then definitely what has kept me in the sport in all the different ways is community. I also really enjoy the connection of doing that alongside other people as an athlete, as a coach, guiding and being part of that. helping others do that. And then same with the advocacy, like just this connection to other people who have similar curiosities about themselves and want to explore. I think that's kind of the thread, is just like being really curious about, just like where you go in these performances. Like it's not, again, not objectively, it's just like the pursuit of that. And then the camaraderie you feel with someone else that's also curious about that is just really cool.
Yeah, that's a good answer. It's similar to somebody we just interviewed, Rebecca Rush, who's an ultra endurance athlete, like spiker. Very similar answer. So that's kind of cool. Very much two very successful athletes in similar but different sports. But yeah, that's awesome. I guess kind of, I'm assuming the answer will be very similar, but what would you say are common traits you see in your athletes or in athletes generally that seem to predict success? Is it that same curiosity?
I think, curiosity, and then maybe how that shows up in like the process of these pursuits. And that's maybe a cliche answer, but truly, if you're not like really into like the daily pursuit of it and like the long term, we're really good as athletes at like delaying gratification in a way, and like being able to see and connect like how today is going to make me more capable of what I'm trying in a year or 2 years. I mean, I have races. UTMB was a race that I've thought about for probably almost like 7 or 8 years, and to put it off that long and think like, well, I need to like strengthen all these areas first. I love that. I think that's so cool to be able to like connect today to like what I want to do down the road. So the athletes that I coach that see joy in that, I mean, you don't always have to enjoy it, but choose the daily pursuit of something, knowing you might not see this pay off for like a really long time. And I get a lot of athletes that are the opposite, I'm like, well, that could be a 5-year goal, and if that's something you want to do in 6 months, then just to say you did it. And that's, again, the same thing. Like, I'm not that motivated by just saying I like did something. I think in some ways in my past, when I was faster and better, I honestly was hurt by the fact that I wasn't that competitive with other people. Like, I always just kind of wanted to feel like I'm doing my thing and I'm going to like test this hypothesis I have today at this race, and I want to execute almost to the point where I'm like have blinders on, which it's times has not been a good thing, but I think it's kept me in the sport for 25 years at this point.
You sometimes see people who are really driven by wanting to be the best. And I say like, you see it more in men. And I don't know if it really is a man thing and a woman thing, but when you actually drill down into it and you look at it, it's the same. Like those people are really, really driven. They're curious about their capabilities. The way that they express that can be different. I mean, there's a whole motivational menu, and what motivates one person may not motivate the other. And I think that was something that Rebecca said to us that kind of stuck, was like, what's the importance of races? Like, why sign up for things like that? And it is because some people are motivated by that, and they're, at a really elite level, they're motivated by beating people. Whereas other people just can be really motivated by, this is my why, I value it, I can see the long-term goal without having to sign up for things. I think it's all kind of the same, even though it can look really, really different on, person to person.
Yeah, totally.
So we do CrossFit, or did CrossFit competitively, and there aren't very many external factors that can change a workout or an event. You know what the workout's going to be. And there are a lot of workouts that you just repeat. It's kind of like running 5K on a track. I mean, yeah, maybe you're contending with some wind or whatever, but for the most part, the conditions remain the same, whether you're doing them in 2015 or 2025. With road running, it's similar. You can run different races, but you can compare, if you do Chicago one year and you do it again, you can compare. Or like you have PRs and it's the same distance. And generally, if you have decent conditions, it's easy to compare. I'm getting into triathlon. I haven't done one yet, but I'm doing a 70.3 in December. And I'm realizing that it's not necessarily about your fastest time in that distance, because the courses are so different, because you have different bike courses, run courses, and then the swim can be drastically different. Some courses are a little shorter. You have river swims and ocean swims and all that. Just kind of along the lines of what you said, I'm struggling to kind of get out of that. Oh, I know what my goal time is going to be, or I know how to compare race to race. I know if I'm getting better. It's not really comparing myself to others, but it's very similar in a way to trail running, I predict, because all the courses are a little bit different. So you have to go into the race kind of assessing your performance on how you feel you did and how you were able to push in your preparation and all that. So it's on similar lines. I thought I would add that for some color.
Yeah, I think it makes it fun, right? I think it's cool to be able to test yourself on different kinds of courses and test those theories and see like, where am I stronger and weaker? Does that actually play out? If yes or no, like strategizing your race plan based on that versus like we were talking about even before we started recording, like you go out for a marathon and track especially, courses can be different, but you're always chasing a fast time. You're always like, which course is a net downhill, or which course always has good weather, or it's still always about the time. Whereas to be able to find different ways for something to show up or a different skill set, that's so fun. For me, it's allowed me to be much more present versus like checking my split every mile and like, cool, I'm still on pace. I'm still on pace. I'm still on pace. And then I'm not anymore versus like, I feel like I'm a strong climber. So I like look forward to the long climbs and I kind of like check in and dial in. And then I know on a downhill, I'm probably going to get past. And maybe that's where I try to rest, and does allow for more context and more ways to improve too. There's just like more dimensions than just am I faster or not faster or stronger or not stronger.
Yeah, definitely way more ways to measure success.
Do you think that's where the mental aspect comes in for ultra that makes it a little bit different than some of the shorter distance like marathon, half marathon, as you are having to kind of navigate more novel situations and also really be able to check in with yourself, not, how fast am I going, but how am I feeling and how am I doing?
Yeah, it's one of them. There's definitely a handful of things that I think make the ultra distances, probably in any sport, unique. One is there's just more variables. There's more variables because of, there's road ultras or even track ultras. And so that's going to eliminate some of the variables, and maybe there's more predictable environmental factors, but there's just more things to consider, more ways something can go, both because of the terrain and then the duration of time you're out there. There's just more things that can go wrong or right in that amount of time. I find that the biggest challenge, though, the biggest jump, or what I think separates ultra events, again, in any sport really, but from everything else, is just like how big of a gap there is between preparation and race demands. Like you just can't replicate it. You're not even going to get close to it. You don't perfectly replicate performance output probably in any sport, but you can get close. 5K, you might do 5 by a K at race pace or even 3 by a mile, and it's going to feel similar. But for me to go run 30 hours, the longest I ran before that race was like 7 hours. I've never even been awake for 30 hours. I think I maybe pulled one all-nighter in college and like thought I was going to die. There's just like such a big jump both in confidence and belief that you can do it, and how you respond in the moment when your brain and body are like, what is happening? I've never done this before, which I think is really fun, but also makes it really challenging.
So how do you, I guess, bit of a tangent, like there's a lot of people that are getting into ultra that are a bit more recreational with it. Maybe they've done a handful of marathons or halves and they're jumping into ultra, which I think is really cool. So I guess, how do you balance building confidence in a person? I mean, yourself as well, but certainly more a recreational person, like building confidence, but also being realistic. Like how important is it to go in knowing I didn't prepare or I can't be prepared for everything, and handling those situations, but also balancing the confidence of like, I know I can do it, or I'm hopeful that I can do it. I guess how do you prepare someone for that?
Yeah, there's just an inherent acceptance that you're not going to be positive. You're just not. And that's not like a fair expectation of yourself, and almost that like that's more anxiety inducing to think that you should be, or because you don't feel super sure about how it's going to go, that's somehow indicative of like not being prepared. I mean, part of it is, I say, especially if I'm coaching someone, like that's my job to worry about whether or not you're prepared. Like you hired me for that. I'm good at it. I've done it for a long time. So you almost like don't need, that's the point of having a coach, is like that, let me worry about that and trust me on that. And then if I'm wrong, let's talk about it. But I'm telling you that you're ready. I've trained for plenty of these things and I've coached lots of athletes to run ultras. I don't have a coach. I haven't had a coach since I stopped running track. And I think it's a benefit of having a coach, is that you're paying for someone else's knowledge and to tell you that you are ready. And I can tell sometimes, like if someone's not almost like looking forward to the uncertainty, it's probably not going to go well. And I can often tell, like when someone's trying their first 100 or even their first, 50K or 50 mile, if like, I can kind of tell sometimes how it's going to go based on these factors you're talking about, how much someone's stressed about not having done more. Often it's the opposite though. I get a lot of people too that like maybe don't even want to do what we're doing. And I'm like, well, we probably shouldn't be trying this race if we're not prioritizing at least getting this 30-mile run in preparation for a 100-mile.
Do you ever see like overconfidence show up?
Yeah, for sure. And to your point, again, often in men that have been good at marathons or triathlons or something like that.
That's so interesting.
And then they probably get a good dose of reality in the race.
Yeah. It's not a bad thing. It's something that you see. I actually did a research project kind of on this when I was in grad school. They had measured both dropout and pace declines in women versus men. And like, I don't remember how many marathons, but like a lot. And how much more men slow down than women. I'm not hating on men. A lot of it's biology, right? Like women are a lot better at pacing and like sustained moderate effort. Men sometimes are more apt to like go really hard, really early. It's kind of funny because I've seen it in ultra running, and I'll see these races. Every race I raced this year from 50K to 100 miles, I passed so many men. I don't think I passed a single woman in any race. And I'm being serious. I don't think I passed a single woman and passed so many guys. And it's like kind of one of my favorite things is, you see them at the beginning and I'm like, oh, I can't wait to pass like 50 of you in the next couple hours. And I'm not trying to hate, but I do think that there's some benefit to maybe naturally how our brains work for like the longer sustained, maybe more accurate idea of what we can do and kind of being able to moderate effort over many, many, many hours.
Yeah, I was looking because Leadville has such a high DNF percentage and their leaderboard is great. So it breaks it down per aid station. So it's really easy to keep track of people and see the change over the course of the race. And, without making a spreadsheet or anything like that, the names at the top for the women, like I would say top 20, were pretty consistent. The same women kind of were in the lead at the beginning and then also at the end. The men shuffled around a lot. So anecdotally, just Leadville, just from poking around the leaderboard, definitely you see the same kind of thing. And then, I think with women, and this is it's a theory, but our brains work quite a bit different as well from a multitasking and problem solving standpoint. So you have to wonder too, does that start to work to our advantage or work to women's advantage late in the race when, maybe men are more prone to making decisions that are not conducive to good performance, where women can kind of dial back, think forward, what's the more globally beneficial decision here? So it's interesting.
It's interesting. There's a lot there. And I think that the sport's gaining a lot of traction in general. And I hope that I was even in grad school, I was pretty surprised by how little psychological research has been done. But I think that there will be more, I hope, because it's super interesting.
I want to ask a question on DNFs and then circle back to the last part of that other question eventually. But since we're on the topic, have you ever DNF'd in a 100 mile? If you have, how do you deal with that? Or even a bad race day, how do you deal with that? And then how do you help your athletes manage disappointment from a bad race day or a DNF?
I'm trying to remember now. I've started 600s and I think I've finished 4. So I've only dropped out of 100 milers. Well, I ran Western States a couple years ago and it was actually, I was more medically pulled. I got heat exhaustion, pretty close to heat stroke, and was advised not to keep going. And that was a really frustrating experience because it was probably the fittest I've ever been in my life. And I just was, similar to what we were just talking about, was so caught up in competing and what other people were doing that I was just not taking care of myself. And in retrospect was wow, I made so many bad decisions because I wasn't willing to stop for 3 minutes and take care of myself, and got in a pretty bad spot. That happened in 2021, I think. And then maybe 6 months or 8 months later, I was running 100K in Arizona and knew that my body was really off. Could tell something was wrong, but was so mad at myself for dropping out of that race that I forced myself through it, which was so stupid. I walked the last 15, 20 miles. And I ended up having very severe rhabdo, almost renal failure. And I was in the hospital for 6 days. Super expensive medical bill, and took me a really long time to feel normal again. And then ran actually Leadville for the second time. It was my first 100 miler years ago, and was running Leadville and had the same symptoms of rhabdo again and stopped immediately because that's just not something you want to mess with. So super legitimate reasons why I've dropped. And I think there's a lot of different reasons to not finish, a 100-mile race. It's part of it. I think that these things are so extreme that there's a lot that's really serious. And I've experienced that where both when something was serious and I did stop, and something was serious and I knew it was serious and wouldn't allow myself to consider that, and then really messed myself up. So what I tell people is there's reasons to drop, and that's kind of a personal decision, and it doesn't always have to be a medical emergency to drop either. UTMB is probably the most severely off track of what I thought it was going to be in terms of how long it was taking me. I've had bad races, but I've had bad races that were a little bit off the mark, but this was hours off the mark. And I think that was really difficult mentally. And as someone, I'm a professional athlete, I get paid to do this. I was not having a good day. I was pretty far back. And I think that, would come into my head at times, what's the point of that? That's not a good performance. I don't know how it was in CrossFit, but having a bad performance affects your ranking, and that affects your ability to get into races. And so I knew that. I knew my score is going to drop after this race. I actually don't know how a DNF affects it. That would be something to look into. I don't think it affects it as poorly though. So that was going through my mind. This is going to affect my potential to get into races next year. But for me, that wasn't worth, I wanted to finish. I was physically capable of finishing. I wasn't, in a bad spot. I coach a girl that got third at Leadville last year in her first 100, and she raced again this year and was having a really bad day and was really struggling and had a complete meltdown multiple times. And I told her, like, you don't have to finish. You know, if you're suffering and this is miserable, you're not doing it for me. You're not doing it for your crew. And she ultimately finished and was like super proud of it. But I guess what I'm circling around is like, that's a personal decision on, I don't just like look down on DNFs and think like that person dropped, they weren't tough enough or whatever. You know, that's a personal decision. And I often encourage people to kind of outline, here's the reasons why it would be legit to stop beforehand so that they consider that. And I think that can be good to share with crews. I've had times when I've considered dropping too much because I felt like my crew didn't step in. And that's a tough thing to balance too. Like, how do you encourage someone in the moment? I think I did a good job with that with her as an athlete. I said, I think you can finish. I think that you've got 8 hours to do the last 25 miles. Like, you have plenty of time. I had the personal experience, which I was talking about earlier, of having dropped at that exact same aid station. And I told her I regretted it. Yeah, I had rhabdo, but I think I probably could have walked it in. I didn't have it extremely. I think I could have walked it in and kind of told her, like, from my experience, I think you can finish and I think you'll be really proud of it. And you can totally stop. And that's also totally okay. And for her, it was, I think, just hearing that it was an option and like hearing some perspective was super helpful. So I think it's a personal decision and there's so many legit reasons to stop. And also having a bad day is not a reason not to keep going, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, to dwell on the athlete that you were working with in Leadville, there's an element of kind of surrendering to a different outcome than you wanted. You know, on one side of the coin, that pressure was probably contributing to how, you know, she was feeling and the meltdowns and just realizing and trying to accept, like, this is not going to be the day that I want it to be. But it's like, if you can release yourself from that pressure and then also find a way to keep going, it can be a day that you're really proud of. And I wonder, like, after that aid station and after making that decision, did she actually like physically start to feel any better?
No.
No.
We had a lot of hours and I think she maybe finished in like 28 or 29 hours. But mentally and emotionally, I think she started to appreciate the experience and the people around her and the aid stations. And physically, she didn't feel better, but mentally, I think she did.
Okay. So still a fairy tale. Great. Yeah, I guess earlier we were talking about people kind of having a little too much confidence sometimes, which to me kind of demonstrates a lack of curiosity. Like, it's sort of saying, like, you know, I know everything there is to know. I know myself. I'm going to crush this, whatever. And that often leads to bad outcomes, whether it's men or women. So when you're dealing with athletes who don't display some of the traits that we talked about before, like namely that curiosity and, you know, kind of finding their limits and doing it in an open-minded way, like, how do you work with them and how do you coach athletes towards a more productive mindset?
I mean, I definitely bring up like appropriate expectations, and I struggle with it a little bit sometimes, but we'll bring someone back down to earth a little bit if needed. I think that's a good coach, you know, to say, like, I get that goal and I think we're probably more here. I've been lucky to coach like pretty receptive, coachable athletes for the most part, but I think it can go either direction. Like, you're also paying someone to use their experience and their knowledge and exposure to this to give you the best preparation and insight into how this is going to go. And sometimes that's been bringing someone back down a little bit. That often looks like me saying, I don't think someone's ready for a distance that they're shooting for yet. And saying, ultimately, what's so interesting about coaches, and this is such a tangent, but it's a weird thing where, like, I work for the athlete, as you both know, like, I work for the athlete. And I think that sometimes, like, I almost see it go the other way and them not realize that. I don't know if it's because we've all been athletes in our past where, like, I was a college athlete, like, I worked for the coach, you know? And I think that sometimes I try to tell them, like, you're paying me to tell you what I think. Ultimately, as long as I don't think it's dangerous, if you want to do this, I'll help you the best I can, but I don't think it's a good idea. And I don't think you're ready. And I think if you were able to put that off or willing to put that off 6 months or a year, you're going to be way more prepared. So ultimately, it's just kind of reminding them that they're paying for your knowledge and expertise. And I'm not going to lie about where I think someone's at. It's also gone the other way where I'm like, I think you're capable of like a lot more than you think you are. And trust me on that. That's the way it usually goes, which is really cool and rewarding. But it is an interesting thing where it's like, you do work for them. And I've had one athlete in my life where we didn't match up to the point where I felt like it was making me almost like I don't feel ethically okay that you're doing things that I'm telling you I don't think you're ready for. And we had to like kind of terminate our professional relationship, which was totally fine and reasonable. But yeah, that someone's paying for me to tell them what I think. So I'll tell them what I think.
Yeah, I coach people, but more like beginner to intermediate, like marathon, road running, 10Ks, 5Ks and stuff. And I find that coaching an athlete and a runner is very different from coaching people in nutrition because they get a dose of reality when they go out running. Like they're looking at a progress photo from someone else saying, well, they did that in a month. Why don't I look like that yet? Nutrition's a little bit, the expectations can be a little bit high in comparison to reality, I think, because of the society we live in and what's put out there in Photoshop and all that. But with running, you can't deny somebody going out and running. And, they run for 2 months or 6 months and they see how much progression they make. And for a lot of people, it's minimal than what they expected. And there's no other option than to just kind of accept that, because if they don't, then it's like, oh, well, then you just quit running. It's almost like running and sport teaches that in its own way. It's a little bit less on the coach to say, well, this is what it is. Like, you're not going to run that fast in the marathon because you can't hold that pace in training. I mean, it's so obvious to most people, I find. Whereas nutrition, it's like there's so much within it and there's so much baggage, or there can be. And I guess it's just a little bit like more difficult. And yeah, I don't know. I was just thinking about that.
I could see that. Yeah, maybe not as objective. Yeah, you're saying their numbers don't lie. So that's always something to work on.
Yeah.
I still get people that are like, I would just want to run my half under 2 hours. And it's like, all right, well, what are your training paces? And they're like 6:05 per K. And it's like, well, you can pull that out. I just, I don't want you to go out there on race day and be really upset because you didn't meet this very arbitrary goal.
Well, I think people's expectations of running goals can be inaccurate or unrealistic when they've never run that race before. But then they do it. And then the next time they run it, it's like, oh, okay. Again, it's like they get served their dose of reality, which can be really good. Mm-hmm. It's like, yeah, they can go into a half marathon expecting to run a sub 2 hour, but then they run it in 2:30 and it's like, okay, there it is. Now I need to run it in 2:20 or 2:10 or whatever. What do I need to do to get it under 2?
We're talking a lot about ultra distance, which is, I just think, very interesting, but running generally, I think a lot of the same things apply. What do you think that most people get wrong when they first get into ultra running or even, marathoning? I think we can put those two together for more entry level people.
Yeah, we've been talking a little bit about maybe overconfidence or wanting to get somewhere without putting in the work. And I've experienced that as a coach, but not often, to be honest. People are pretty down to work hard. And actually what I see is maybe what I see more often, or what I see as being more common, is the flip side of that, like not taking their easy days easy, or, I prescribe most of my workouts unless we're training for a very specific time and distance. And even then it's just for a certain block where I might prescribe pace. But for the most part, it's like RPE, and I see all their data. And so especially when I work with a new athlete, I'm really observant of this to see their tendencies, where if this runs a 4 out of 10, just easy recovery miles, or this runs this, and I see their heart rate and I'm like, ooh, that's like an 8 out of 10 probably. So I kind of see the opposite of folks maybe getting like not willing to be flexible or getting too tied to the times. I coached a woman who, it was actually a really fun project. Her and her son, I coached both of them. He's 18 and she has been running marathons forever. And she was trying to run a marathon PR and he was they were both trying to run BQs, and they did, but they didn't get the like 7 or 8 minutes under or whatever craziness it was this year. And sometimes it's like me telling them, you're running the times, like the times that you are running, you can run a 3:15 marathon or whatever we're trying to run, which is cool. So I think I see people getting too tied, too inflexible, too strict in thinking they can never have an off workout, not taking runs easy when they're supposed to be running easy, running in that gray zone too often. I think that actually I see as being maybe the thing people get wrong, is thinking they have to go hard all the time, every mile.
Yeah, I think that's pretty consistent with what we see. And a lot of that, it's people who just come from a mixed endurance background, but definitely people who come from that like CrossFit space where there's that mentality of like, every workout has to be harder. It's not effective, where it's like, well, your hard workouts aren't actually as hard as you think they are because you're stuck in this sort of middle gray zone of intensity. And your easy days are what actually allow you to touch on some real intensity. And if you're not willing to do that, you'll never really apply the right stress to adapt to. And that can take a long time to get people out of, honestly. That it takes sort of like multiple race attempts where you're like, okay, I didn't run that any faster than last time. And it's like, well, yes, are you willing to kind of change your approach and figure out how to do this correctly? So yeah, I'd say that's pretty universal.
To switch over a little bit to nutrition, I remember way back, it was back in our old house, so probably 2.5 or 3 years, Meredith said something about, oh, Addie eats something with like cheese or
It may have been something you posted with one of your long runs where you're eating like a cheeseburger or something just like totally off the wall.
No, it wasn't a cheeseburger.
Well,
it was something like,
I don't remember what it was.
something like, I don't want to assign language to food, but it wasn't the healthiest. As somebody who's getting into running, and I came from CrossFit where the nutrition side of things is a little bit disordered. And then you get into running and you have to be eating some lower quality foods just to get the calories in. And I think sometimes when someone says, oh, you know, Addie, who's this amazing runner, is eating this, it's kind of like, it does take a little bit of the language of food away. It's like, oh yeah, it's just calories. And anyways, I'm wondering, like, what does your nutrition look like on a day-to-day? And then, but what have you learned for nutrition in running, for long runs, and I guess a little bit about your current race day and pre-race nutrition? So like, but what you eat before races and then during, and then just your general diet.
Yeah, I mean, that's been like one of the things I've had to clean up the last couple of years. I was known for just eating trash all the time. I had a friend like almost like have an intervention with me when I started having a lot of injuries and stuff that was like, listen, I love you, but like you don't eat well. And a lot of it, I can blame a lot of things. There was definitely a period of time where I was like in grad school, coaching at a high school full time, training as a professional athlete and commuting an hour and a half to grad school every day, each direction. And so a lot of it I blamed on like the way that a PT would phrase it, which I agreed with, was like, first, you just need to be getting enough gas in the tank. That's number one. Number two, it does matter the quality of the gas. So it was like, if I'm choosing, I would honestly go through the McDonald's drive-through like 4 times a week because I could have planned better and meal prepped for sure. There's no excuse. But I always looked at it like I have never, and I feel very fortunate about this from being in the sport for a really long time. I've never underfueled, at least intentionally. I think I've underfueled unintentionally, not realizing like how much you need. But that's never been a challenge for me. I had really great coaches. I was never in an environment where that was something that was talked about or stressed. And so I've never struggled with that. So I was always like, I just need to be getting gas in the tank. So I'll get a cheeseburger and a McFlurry. Or long runs, yeah, I would often take like a bag of bacon and Oreos and some potatoes or something, or tater tots. But that's something that it wasn't sustainable. Like I wasn't getting the nutrition I needed. I've had a lot of injuries and like just not felt great for a couple of years. So I've really changed that. I think my partner's really good cook and conscious of fruits and vegetables, which I never really used to eat ever. So that's helped just me be more aware. I think you can get away with more when you're in your 20s than your late 30s. And so I've really made a conscious effort. So I think now I generally think I have like a pretty healthy diet and I'm aware of the quality of what I'm eating. I feel different when I eat better. The race context question is an interesting one because I don't know how much y'all follow like ultra running like generally, but that's actually like the buzz topic right now, I would say, is everything is like grams of carbs per hour. People are like really pushing the limits on that. And a lot of folks winning races are talking about that, like how many grams of carbs per hour they're getting in, which is pretty cool. I do think that it's almost like ahead of the curve of research and that kind of thing. And, you know, there's a lot of nuance and these people who are eating 150 grams of carbs per hour, like the guy that won Leadville. I have athletes coming to me and then talking about that. I'm like, yes, but that person's operating at like really high capacity where, you know, people get latched onto that number and then want to be eating that much when they're going objectively at a much less of an exertion. And then they're having all kinds of stomach problems. And there's like, okay, well, it's not just like one number, but it is interesting. And that's something I also have made a concerted effort towards in my own racing, is trying to increase how much I was fueling during. I think I've very much underfueled in racing, mainly because I struggle with stomach issues. But that's something that I think is going to keep trending as being a buzz topic. People are almost talking about that and the products available, like we were talking about super shoes, 4 or 5 years ago. There's also just more nutrition products that are available that I think is really cool to see, so that we're not having to pound Snickers bars and tater tots and stuff in races. And then I guess like just a side note to that, I do think that there's in my opinion, you can't run a 30-hour race on gels and drink mix. So there is some kind of requirement to have some solid food in your belly. And for some reason, when you're that deep in it, it's the trash that's like more appealing, the like chips or potatoes, or, I mean, that's not that trashy, but just that to me, I'm like, I can probably get that down. I'm not going to get down something healthy right now. So that is, I think, a little bit in the ultra running culture of just someone like scarfing down pizza or, something in the middle of a race.
Yeah, like the sports nutrition side of it, the intrafuel that's getting really big in cycling too. And part of it is the products that are available are so much better than they were 10 or 15 years ago. Like, having gels that are higher volume and with mixed carb sources that your body's just better able to handle. Like, I mean, back in 10, 15 years ago, your only option was like goo or hammer gels. And those things just are brutal after, 6 or 8 hours. So you kind of have to start introducing, Snickers and chips and stuff like that, which I think is really well intentioned and kind of solves a really important problem for your body mid race. And, I think there is a lot to gain from understanding what timing and what concentration works for you. Like 150 grams an hour, that is like pushing the limits of what the human body can handle. It's doable, but that's obviously an athlete who spent a lot of time working with nutritionists and people who understand that and probably tested a lot of things out. People who are running slower. Like I think Herman Poncer is that researcher out of Duke who's done a lot of research on essentially like energy economy in humans. And he's looked at running as really linear. And so that's what he looks at most commonly. And he's found that you can almost consider like calorie intake by distance, which is, an ultra endurance or a runner who's going to run a marathon in 2 hours and 20 minutes can consume essentially the same amount of carbs as a runner that's going to run that marathon in 4 hours, but the concentration per hour is really different. And so that's kind of how he's figured out to conceptualize it, which I think is a pretty good starting point. So if someone's, running Leadville in 16 hours, a person running it in 30 hours might benefit more from like a 75 gram per hour intake as a starting point. And then, obviously introduce more complex foods as you go.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I mean, that does make sense, but that's interesting. And I agree. I think that 75 to 90 range is going to be best for most people. And he was talking about, and this kind of makes sense to me too, is you're using more the harder you're pushing and the higher your like aerobic output. And so, yeah, just this idea of like also factoring that into the race. I think there's been times when I tend to struggle later and most people do. And I'm sure that there's a lot of factors. One, yeah, by the time you're on your 30th gel, you're like, that's hitting different than your second one, but you're also probably slowing down. And so maybe that's something to kind of keep in mind. And I kind of like that, maybe thinking about it instead of per hour, per 10K or something, thinking about it per distance. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it at least gives you a starting point. And then everybody becomes a bit more oxidative late in the race. So you're not using carbs really as readily as you might at the beginning. So it's like, okay, what does that feel like? And then how do we address that as it happens? And that's just like kind of something you learn through experience, I think. But random question, do you do anything for sodium or like salt intake during races?
Yeah, that's such an interesting one because my understanding is most of the research does not support that there's any relationship between sodium deficiency and cramping. And I'm like, cool, anecdotally, it does for me. And maybe that's just in my brain.
I don't believe the science. I'm like struggling to wrap my brain around it.
The reason I asked is there were 2 studies. One was released last year, 2023. One was this year, early in the year. And it's by the same researcher. And he's out of, I can't remember, Alan Kurdi maybe. But he's like the salt guy. And so essentially, I mean, he's been in exercise science his whole career. And so his lab ran this super high quality, they did a model and then they ran a study with, it was like 9 high level ultra endurance runners, which like very small, but really well set up. So they had all these hypotheses. Like we think that the no salt group will have higher RPE. The salt group might have increased thirst, like all the things that you would expect to see. And basically like it didn't matter. It didn't make a difference, which is nuts. I think that at the ultra distance, it starts to just like above a certain period of time. And he does say that. But yeah, I think that sodium is really misunderstood. I think it's doing something. I think the mechanism is we just aren't sure what it's doing. And obviously, if it's something that you crave, you're not craving it for no reason. So you kind of alluded to it helps you with cramps. Like, what has it done for you? How do you implement it? What does that feel like when you do a good job versus not doing a good job?
Do you do like milligrams per hour or do you kind of go by feel, how much you're sweating, all that? Or have you done a sweat test?
I haven't done a sweat test. I do think I would like to, and I do think it can be beneficial. It does seem to be fairly individual, maybe more individual than some things, just based on your sweat content and how much you sweat. I don't sweat a lot. I think that's maybe even a challenge for me. But yeah, to your point, I mean, I think that's what I encourage people with is like, yes, there's research. It's important. Let's listen to that. But also like, I know my body and I know that I've gotten Charlie horses and cramps when I wasn't eating enough sodium. That's just what has happened. I also can tell often if I feel like I'm bonking or I feel like an energy drop and I know it's not calories, sodium can feel really similar to me. I also just do better with liquid calories. So I hardly ever drink just water. And so I know that I'm getting at least a good amount of sodium just with what I'm drinking. But then I always carry a bunch of the salt stick tablets, and I can tell when I need it. My asterisk is like, I'm not a medical professional. This is not a recommendation. And in my opinion, it's probably much harder to overdo sodium than to underdo it. And so I always am just like, I'm probably like, what is the danger of that? I get a little like bloated. And I mean, even if you look at salt stick, the capsules or the tablets, the fast chews, it's like, just don't eat more than 50 in a day. And I'm like, well, I've never eaten that many. And so I just think the risk of like underdoing it is probably higher than the risk of overdoing it. And that's not a coaching recommendation. That's just guided my own. I mean, there's factors too that come into play. Like, where are you racing? What is the temperature? Like, are you sweating? Is it, high altitude? I feel like I need them more when I'm training here. So I do think it's misunderstood, and I respect the research, and it doesn't line up with what I've experienced. So, at the end of the day, trust your own experience with your own body is my opinion.
Yeah, it's hard to, the placebo effect is so valid. If you feel that something has helped you historically and you've had good days with it and bad days without it, I know science is science, but it is hard to just remove something that you feel helps you and mentally be okay with that immediately. And like, no one wants to run the risk in any race because they trained hard for it. So I guess the placebo effect is definitely part of it too. And it is part of knowing yourself. And like you said, I don't think it hurts. I think if we were talking about like the general population and the amount of sodium people are consuming with these products, different story, just in case the listeners are confused. We're talking like people who are exercising and running quite a bit here and supplementation during training and races. So yeah, I mean, I've been telling my athletes, like, I mean, this is what the science says, but that's not necessarily my recommendation if you feel good with it. And I always start people, if they want to try sodium supplementation, I go on the low end first and then slowly build up, because it can cause stomach issues and things like that if it's not done incrementally and properly. But that's not anything different than adding training mileage or adding carbs per hour. I mean, you have to adapt to it and know that you're going to be okay. To kind of switch topics a little bit, is there like a off season at all in trail running? Like, I know you pick your races and there are probably a bunch of different races in the summer, spring, and fall. Is there kind of an off season in the winter? And after something like UTMB, how much time are you taking off? I wonder if it's race dependent or if you have like a strict, I don't run for this amount of time and then I don't race for another 6 to 8 months. Like, what's your approach there?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, these races are so long and take so much out of you. I actually think that and it's hard to get into races. In some ways, it kind of limits over racing to a degree, which I think is a good thing. It can be challenging too. I raced like 4 times last year, had 2 pretty decent races, 1 terrible one. I think it's also can be frustrating not getting as many opportunities to compete. Just generally, people probably race about that much. I would say most people probably consider late fall through winter as an off season generally, but there's big races October, November, and then the race season kind of starts back up in February if you want it to. So it kind of just depends on the person. Generally, for most people that I'm coaching, I recommend at a minimum, I tend to go off of 1 day per 10 miles raced, like at a minimum. So after a 50K, at least 3 days off. After a 100 miler, you're taking at least 10 days off. Most people will take, maybe longer than that or that totally off and then transition back into easy running. I tend to follow something pretty similar depending on where I'm at in the season or how hard I raced or, if it was a training race and I didn't go as hard, maybe not. As much as it's, like I said, nice that it might limit people in over racing, I do think the FOMO is real. There is, it almost would be better if there was an off season because and then everybody would be like, nobody's training and racing right now. But I think people get antsy or maybe don't take as much time because they see other people are still racing, or races are always happening the whole year. It's not like a football season or basketball season. I sometimes wish that were the case. I think it'd be easier to check out. I don't take a lot of downtime usually, but I've started taking more. I run most days. I probably take 10 or so days off a year typically. This most recent race, I traveled for a bit after the race and then actually got COVID for the first time. I had never had it on the way home and ended up taking like kind of 3 weeks off. And I'm still not really running now just because of life is crazy at the moment. But I think it's a good thing. I think I took off more time than I normally would have. And my old coach used to say you have to get out of shape to get in shape. And I kind of agree to some, it's like tongue in cheek. It's like kind of a joke, but at the same time, you can't just like maintain. You have to cycle through. And I struggle with that myself. So I think there's some benefits and some pros and some cons to kind of how the ultra running scene is competition wise.
similar to CrossFit. So yeah, we're familiar with that. If you wanted to train every day of the year and do every competition, you could do one once a month easily. And it's like, I mean, I know a little bit about running on social media. It seems a little bit similar, like kind of small sport growing just based on the communities and social media. And it is hard when you're seeing, your competitor or your friend out running or doing a workout and you're like, I got to get in the gym or I got to get out there, or like, what's their mileage? And yeah, it's tough.
Yeah. So we'll kind of wrap up talking about 3 of the things that you've worked on. And the first is your book, which you wrote back in maybe around 2021. And we've recommended it to a lot of people, not just ultra runners, just because it's so full of really helpful tools and information. And I find the layout and kind of the workbook style to be really engaging. So I was wondering where that project or where that idea came from, and then what gaps you were looking to fill with it.
Yeah. So I coached for forever. I coached college, high school, post-collegiately. And back in maybe 2018, 2019, was trying to actually find, it was when I was transitioning out of my track career, was trying to find like a sports psychologist to work with, and did, but felt like there was just some gaps in what I was looking for. It didn't feel super accessible. It was really expensive. It just felt like, man, this is like not as readily available as it should be. And so that kind of had me thinking like, I'm a really good coach. I know that. I'm confident in my coaching skills, but there's a lot of really good coaches, many really good coaches. And I was like, this feels like a missing resource, especially where I live in Boulder, Denver. And luckily, the University of Denver is considered one of the best, if not the best program in the country. And so I went to school there kind of wanting to learn more and be able to provide that resource to other people. And then while I was in school, actually is when I got into ultra running. I did my first 100 while I was in school, I think, or like right before I started. And I just was like immediately like, whoa, something really unique is happening in this sport. Like there's a psychological component to every sport, but this is like so psychological that I started becoming really curious and was trying to find research and trying to find people that had worked with ultra runners. And there just was like nothing, like literally nothing. And so I think it was actually my advisor in the program was kind of like, I mean, you're pretty qualified to like look into this. And so my whole approach to the book was like, none of that is my information. It was kind of like the cliff notes or spark notes to tons of different resources that from my own experience, I think apply to ultra running. Lots of different psychologists, research that's been done, mental skills, mental tools. So that's kind of how I looked at it. Luckily, I got the book deal right when COVID started. So I basically was writing this and researching like during the height of lockdown, which was, a great use of time, obviously. So I just basically spent like a year reading everything that I could read and researching everything that I could research that I felt like applied, and then kind of just condensed it into, essentially like a workbook. But also I think the most useful part of that book is probably the like reference list. If anything speaks to someone, or I tried to really set it up that way. Like if this feels like something that applies most to you, like here's some things you should check out. So really it was trying to fill a gap in information that I wanted, that I couldn't find and didn't feel like existed, and felt like I was in a good place to maybe try to like pull a lot of information from different areas and like put it into one place. I also know a lot of athletes personally and felt like I could have pretty candid conversations with them. The case studies were really fun. And I think that helps too, just having kind of personal connections to a lot of these people. And they were willing to talk to me and kind of give me some insight into their training and preparation.
Yeah, it really connects like theory and experience in a really great way.
Your book is like that book that's like a gold mine that you find when you have to write an article, like if you're a psych student with the references, it's like all there. And it's like, okay, well, I just pull these, and it just brings me back to my college days. So if you're a psych student out there and you need to write an article on this,
there you go.
That's your book. So you're a bit of an advocate in the LGBTQ plus space. What's the genesis and story of OUTrun?
Kind of similar, like just decided to create something that didn't exist that I was like looking for. I didn't feel like there was much overlap in my life between running community and like queer community. Like I had them maybe separately. But I was like, oh, how cool would it be if I found some people that also liked to do the same things I do? So I started like looking for group runs or meetups in Denver, and there just weren't that many, or at least not with the like demographic that I relate to. And so we just decided to kind of start very casual, like meetup at first. And it kind of just, kind of grew into something a little bit more. And there's obviously a lot of hot topics and like things happening in race regulation world, especially at the time, during kind of the creation of this, that I felt like deserved some attention too. And we don't have any answers, and we don't like work that closely with races or anything. But I think giving people a space to talk about that, or getting input from people that we know. And we've had some local races we worked with to kind of create better policies. But the main intention was just connection and creating a space for people to like meet up. So we have a chapter in Boulder and a chapter in Denver, San Francisco. And it's really cool. Yeah, people, go to races together, crew each other. And that's always like makes me the most happy, is when I see people, there's that relationships have extended outside of a meetup or something. So the main goal was just like, oh, this doesn't exist and it should. And I guess maybe we can just do it.
That's awesome. Trying to figure out how to say this. When Meredith and I both came out, it was difficult because, similar to you, I think we identified first and foremost as athletes. And we had our athlete communities all growing up through high school, college, and then like through CrossFit. And then I think we both, at least I did, I had like a separate kind of like group of LGBTQ people that I would hang out with. I played on like a slow pitch team, and it was like so different. And then, you start meeting, and I think through our community online and stuff with Tactic, you start meeting more people who are gay and like sports, and you're like, this is what I need. You need both of those things together, both of your identities, because otherwise you're just kind of, and this could dive deeper into a big identity talk, but I think it's nice when you feel safe in like all aspects of yourself. And like for at least us, and probably you, being an athlete and then being gay, or however you want to describe yourself, it's really nice to have that both in one place, because they're just such big parts of ourselves. So that's really cool that you created that. And I think running is very accessible to people, but a lot of people need a place to go and do it. They don't necessarily know where to start, or they don't want to do it by themselves, or it helps to have the accountability. So I always like the idea of run clubs, whether they're virtual or in person, but it's a great way to connect.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think visibility was important to me too. At the time, I had just signed with Nike, and at Leadville, I paced my friend Ryan Montgomery, who ended up first in the non-binary division. And he and I joke, he's like, he introduced me to his boyfriend, and he's like, yeah, remember how I told you there's only one other professional trail runner that's gay? This is her. And I'm like, but that's probably not true, right? Like, it's just like we don't see it. And to your point, I remember being in college, and like, that's a great way to put it. I very much more identified with being an athlete and wanting to keep competing than I did with that. And so I'm like, I'm going to push that aside. Like, I don't see anybody else doing that. So clearly that's not a thing. So I think that was important. But then, yeah, with our group runs and meetups, I think what was most important to me was like, it's cool to see people talking about being more welcoming. It's cool to see conversations happening. It's cool to see policy changes. All that's cool. But like kind of what you were just getting at, I want to like meet people. Like I want to like be connected to people, not just like, that's a different thing. And that's kind of our only real goal, is like, we're just actually trying to literally connect people and give people a place to meet other people. And like I said, it makes me so happy when I run into folks at races, or like see people crewing each other that met at our events. That's the whole point, is creating like actual opportunities for relationships and like real community. And that, like when I say community, I mean like literally like getting together, having people to call, like a support system, not like an abstract thing, like a real thing.
Yeah. I think a lot of organizations pay lip service to both community and inclusivity. And it's, actually being inclusive is different. Actually having community is different. And then, on a grassroots level, getting different people together, maybe pushing for non-binary divisions and small races, because that's where you affect change. Like, it's great that Leadville has it. It's great that, Boston has non-binary. Are those races going to start meaningful conversations? Probably not. But if your local 5K has a non-binary because a group advocated to put it in, like now maybe someone in your community who's signing up in that division. So you're going to be like, okay, I don't really know what non-binary means. Like, would you mind explaining that to me? And so then you can have a conversation that starts to shift the way that people see the world versus, people just get angry at Boston and yell at each other in comment sections. And it's like, that's not doing anything. I mean, I'm still really glad that those divisions exist, but how you affect change is small community. So I think that's a really cool thing.
I think with running too, because you can make it very individual and solitary. You can just go for a run. I love running by myself. I don't need it. I actually prefer it. And then I joined the swim club because I'm doing a triathlon and I'm meeting all these people, and I'm like, hey, exercising with people ain't so bad. It's kind of nice to like see people face to face and like chat and say like, wow, this drill is really hard. And I run certain races when I'm ready, but I'm not somebody who just goes out and runs a race because it's in my hometown. But I said to Meredith, oh, there's a Fernie half marathon on Friday or on Sunday. Maybe I should just go run it. Like, I'm not ready to run a half right now, but like, I could just go and do it at like 90% and see how I do. And it was like, yeah, just go show your face and be a part of the community. It helps too, because it's a very small town and the community is small, but yeah, it is nice to connect with people on that level, but it takes an effort.
It does, but I think that's one reason why I love ultra running so much is I agree. Like, I train mostly alone and I'm fine with that, but you can't go to 100-miler without asking for help, and like I had my partner and one of my best friends flew to France to spend 30 hours. They didn't sleep either, helping me. And I think I really like that aspect of it and think that's why the sport creates a nice natural opportunity for more community and connection, is because you can't do it by yourself. And it's so vulnerable to be the one asking for help and knowing you're going to have people like I have been in my most vulnerable, lowest moments with some pacers and crew. Like, they have seen some things. And I think that's awesome. And it's kind of like a natural opportunity to take advantage of that and create, opportunities for the connection in space and opportunities for people that do want to show up and help and be part of that.
Yeah. I guess in keeping on the topic of community and opportunities, it sounds like the big thing that you have going on coming up is this adventure lodge that you're working on at Twin Lakes outside of Leadville. So yeah, what's that going to be about and when are you going to be done with it?
Yeah, that's been a long-term dream. I'm super fortunate. My parents have been really involved in my life and running career forever and always kind of talked about this project probably for over a decade. And they're retiring and willing to invest in it. So back to the original thread I was describing of connection and community, that's my favorite thing. There's nothing I love more than being out on trails with other people or being part of someone's progress or working towards something. So the vision was we have a 60-acre, what used to be a ranch. We're finishing construction on a small, it's not that small, 11-bedroom adventure lodge where we'll host retreats and group camps for people, definitely very broad in terms of what could happen. Plenty of, people like you bring your community in, but both have a space available to other kinds of communities. But for me, we'll be hosting a lot of trail running. It's right on the Leadville 100 mountain bike course. So maybe some mountain biking and just have a space for people to come together and learn from each other and learn from experts in different topics, get out on the trails together. So we should be finishing construction, I really hope, by the end of this year. We're kind of in the last phases, but those seem to be the ones that take the longest. My mom's a contractor and designer, so she designed the whole thing. It's beautiful. And then hopefully having retreats next year.
Nice. Yeah, I imagine Leadville is a lot like building here. It's a short season for building. So it's kind of like a, rush and get as much done as you can before the snow comes. But that's really cool. And then I guess, do you see it as are you going to try to build up a team or a specific community that uses it often? Or is it really going to be let's bring as many different people in as we can? How do you see yourself using it?
I think both. With where it is, it's definitely an attractive location and natural destination for mountain bikers and trail runners. I mean, just because of the race series that goes on there, just the trails that are there, it's a beautiful place. There's a big rafting culture there, huge fly fishing culture there that I don't know anything about, but I'm sure that there's still opportunities for people to kind of connect. My partner's a therapist and a yoga instructor, and I know could have some really magical wellness retreats. I think it'll happen organically, but our intention, or I guess a mission statement was just to create a space for people to connect and learn and grow. And I think what that could look like or how that could happen is really broad, which is really awesome. And we're kind of just going to see, how it unfolds.
Do you have a name picked out?
It's called Sagestone Adventure Lodge. Yeah, it's a really, really beautiful, awesome place. And I'm super excited to share it with some people once it's done.
Yeah, we're excited to see it. I guess the last thing, and since it's on the mountain bike route, is do you see yourself doing the lead challenge in the next little bit?
I would love to. I have a little bit of history to uphold, I guess, or not history, but the woman people we bought the lodge from, she's, in her 60s, was a professional cyclist for a while, but she was, I'd have to fact check this, but I'm pretty sure it's true. So for people that don't know, Leadville Race Series is through the whole summer. And there's a series of races from 10K marathon, 50-mile run and bike in the same weekend, one on each day, and then 100-mile at each. The 100-mile bike and run are only a week apart. So the mountain bikes first, and then a week later is the run. And she was the first woman to ever do both in the same year. Before lead challenge was a thing, I think. This was like, I think back in the 90s or something. I mean, I'm like, oh, well, now I have to because Barb did it and she's pretty badass. The lead challenge is you do every race. So you choose between the 50 mile. You don't have to run and bike in the same weekend. You choose which one. I would love to. My mountain biking skills need to improve. That scares me more than anything, but it sounds like a really exciting challenge and maybe something that makes me feel excited for when my professional running career starts to, when I'm done with that, I still would love to find ways to push myself and do something new. And yeah, the fact that it goes literally by the place would be really awesome. I watch it every year at the mountain bike race. So yeah, I'm saying 10-year plan for sure, but maybe 5 years.
You'll see Meredith next year, maybe biking by.
Yeah.
Are you doing the bike?
Yeah.
Nice.
Pretty much anyone, like I've gotten to know some of the Lifetime people and just various organizations, and they're so desperate for women to do their events, the biking events more specifically, that it's pretty much if you're a woman and you register, you're in. Like just it's immediate. Everyone else goes through a lottery. I think Leadville may be a bit more selective, but things like Unbound, Big Sugar, like the big cycling event, if you want to do them, just sign up. You'll get in. No lottery.
It's awesome to see that every year. And I mean, participation rates are growing on the women's side, but they're still pretty small, I think, in ultra events in general. And I would imagine maybe even lower in mountain biking than in running.
Yeah, I think it's around 10% in a lot of the bike races. Yeah. And they're working really hard. There's just so many barriers to it. So yeah, that's kind of something that we're working on getting our community more into this year is the cycling events. And then we already have a lot of runners. So
well, we should talk about that because that's kind of like my dream with a lot of the stuff at the lodge is I want to do a lot of women's focused things where I get so many questions like, aren't you afraid to do these big 14ers, which are big mountains? Like I'll go do 2 or 3 in one run, like by yourself, or what do you take at night? Or so just knowledge sharing and removing barriers with just information of like, yeah, we have more things to think about, but also you can do it, and here's maybe some bike maintenance, or here's what I carry on a long ride in case something happens, or I have a little kit that I always carry when I run by myself. So we should talk because that's kind of the whole point of this place is helping people feel more confident in doing their things and to be safer doing them too.
Yeah, all of that. We will talk. Don't worry. If people wanted to find you, where's the best place to find you online or stay up to date with what you have going on?
Good question. I'm taking a social media break for at least the rest of the year. So I don't have social media right now. So I don't send me an email.
Yeah, the old fashioned way. Yeah.
Yeah, I will go back, but I am in a transitional period of my life and wanted to really be sure I'm hearing only my voice and people's voices that I'm pursuing. So I'm taking a break for a while, so I'm not online anywhere, but send me an email or I have a contact form on my mental performance website. I will be sharing stuff about the lodge when that opens. So that could also be a route to go, but yeah, not on social media right now.
That's awesome. As someone who runs a social media page, that is literally the dream. One day I'm just going to pull the
move
plug
to the mountains and be inaccessible. But yeah. We've done part 1. Part 2 will come when we can retire.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, there's totally a way to do it I'm not a social media hater, but yeah. And I'm selling my house and moving to the mountains in a month. So that's what I did. I just flipped my life upside down and nothing was wrong. It was all good, but sometimes you need a break and that's a good thing.
It's just noisy. Well, gosh, I know we ran over, so I really appreciate your time. This was a really interesting conversation. We really are grateful to have you on, and we'll make sure that we share your book, your website, and then, any information on the lodge, once it goes up, we'll make sure we share that as well. So
awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was really fun.